around him are all these headstones of people self-identified as journalists, as politicians, as fighters for racial self-determination, many of whom were murdered by despots and regimes because these people were also communists and socialists, good Marxists. And so they too are buried as close to their scene as they possibly could get. That's a phenomenon. Now the rest of us aren't that lucky. So what could we do about this? Talk about enchantment. How many are familiar with the Catholic practice of body relics? Relics, you've heard of that? Relics of saintly persons, which could be fingers, toes, parts of arms. The heart was favored because the heart was believed to be the organ of sentiment. These things would be taken off of the deceased person and distributed to churches and particularly cathedrals where these relics would become sites of pilgrimage. So people would go to where the charisma is. I have seen in Padova they call it, St. Anthony's tongue. Now that tongue is 2,000 years old. St. Anthony, I think. St. Anthony or St. Stephen? St. Stephen, I think, who was an early orator of Christianity. And because he was an orator, the tongue, charisma, his tongue is in a little church in Padova. Now what it looks like is a piece of gum that was scraped off University Avenue a year or two ago. There isn't much to see. But you go down into the crypt into this little church, and it's dark. And you see a light up in front of you, and you go up there. And pretty soon you see people, usually on their knees, and usually old women, moving slowly along on their knees. My wife and I are embarrassed to be walking upright, because at the end of the light is a little chamber with a glass box and spotlights, kind of little tiny spotlights coming in on, and a red pillow, and there's St. Anthony's tongue. The charisma that radiates from that. And these people moving up because they've made a vow, they've made a request to the saint. Maybe it was answered, maybe it hasn't been yet. They're back with more prayers. And you see them shuffling up and crossing themselves and then mumbling their prayers. So this kind of relic practice continues. It continues in Seattle in an interesting sort of way. What is the name of the Catholic hospital in Tacoma? Was a mother somebody who founded it? Can't remember.
No clue.
Okay, there was a woman who was a nun who went up and down the West Coast in the late 1800s and started hospitals and orphanages and charities all over the place, a mother somebody. I was told, I do not know this as a fact, but I was told that there is a relic of Mother, whatever her name is, in the altar in St. James Cathedral, down on 9th and Spring, or thereabouts. There's a relic of her there. There is more than a relic in that room, or there's additional relics as well. I was sitting down there one evening, taking in Mozart's funeral mass, appropriately enough. It's a public concert, I'm sitting there. And I noticed there's brass beadwork on the floor right in front of me, very near the altar, because I was sitting near the altar. And it goes across, and it comes down, goes across, and there's a little gap all around it. And as I'm listening to Mozart's mass, funeral mass, requiem mass, I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, that's just room enough to drop a casket down in there. So during the intermission, I asked one of the ushers, what is that? Oh, Mary says, we recently built that when we remodeled the cathedral. Archbishop so-and-so, he's down there near the altar, and we have room for 7 more. Whoa! Yes, yes. Don't tell me the world isn't enchanted. So these relics became really quite important to people. Now, there's another thing to do with bodies, though, besides putting them in the ground. And this is a kind of contemporary practice of kind of a semi-sacred, and I think in a certain way also an enchanted practice. Cremation came along in this country in the late 19th century. It was proposed as an alternative to embalming, which was first came into widespread use during the Civil War, when soldiers were embalmed because families in the North were damned if their son was going to be buried in Southern soil. And so there was a lot of political pressure to bring them home and to embalm them. And at one point, Washington, D.C. was the embalming capital of the world. Not everybody thought embalming was such a great idea, and I don't either. And in most of the non-English speaking world, people are appalled when they hear about it. That's an English speaking world practice. It goes on, yeah.
What's embalming?
Embalming?
Is that just like chemicals?
Oh, that is disgusting. Most bodies that go in the ground are embalmed. That means, this is purely for cosmetic reasons, nothing else. That means basically your insides are pumped out. There's a device called a trocar, big slit here, it goes in and break everything up, it's all suctioned out, you're filled up with formaldehyde. Then you are cosmetically treated, your hands and face particularly, because that's what shows in the coffin. And you're prepared for open casket display. And the selling point is that it preserves the body. It doesn't. But it preserves it long enough to get through the funeral. I'm not going to describe for you what goes on a few weeks later because it's disgusting. Most bodies go into the ground embalmed. So they're filled with formaldehyde, basically. They're pickled with formaldehyde. There are people who said this is disgusting, and it is. It's expensive as well, but most people do it. So cremation was proposed as an alternative. Now this is interesting where cremation, I'm going to talk about 2 examples. One is America and then one is India. And I'm going to show you some overheads in India. It's kind of interesting because the contrast is pretty striking about how they do it versus how we do it. In this country, if you want to be cremated, which is a choice and it's less expensive than embalming and ground burial, your body is, after the ceremony, put into a gas-fired oven that runs for about an hour and a half at about 1,400 degrees. And there's nothing left but it's called ashes, but they aren't ashes, really. They're called cremains after cremation. And basically, they look like kind of coarse granular sand. That's all that's left. People are given these in a little paper carton about the size of an egg carton, or sometime in a plastic bag. You can do with them what you want. You can put them in an urn, or you can scatter them. I will tell you, the glaciers on Mount Rainier are full of cremains, starting at the top and working down. There are cremains of hundreds of people up there, and it's perfectly legal to do. I mean, these are, come on, they've been fired at 1,400 degrees. You're not going to poison anybody. It's basically sand. It's calcium, is what it is. And those cremains are on a, who knows, 2,000, 3,000 year trip down the Squally Glacier. And will finally come into Puget Sound down at the Squally Delta, provided it's not all silted up by that time with other people's cremains. People like to have ashes scattered in favorite spots, often bodies of water. That's pretty common. On mountaintops, that's common. In rivers, that's common. You could have your cremains scattered in your backyard garden if you wanted to. And